topics, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. This episode is ad-free, and I rely on my audience to support my efforts. If you're getting value from this content, please consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Mind and Matter Substack. For just $5 a month, you'll get early access to episodes and other content, full episode transcripts, and I'll prioritize answering your questions in emails and the comments sections. You can also support me by checking out the links in the episode description to my affiliate partners who make various health and wellness products that I use and enjoy myself. You'll receive a discount and help support the podcast that way. And if you want the benefits of a paid subscription, but it's not in your budget, simply sign up for my free weekly newsletter, send me an email, and I'll give you a complimentary paid subscription. Word of mouth is the best way to help the podcast grow. So if you like what I'm doing, please share your favorite episodes with family and friends. The purpose of the podcast is to provide you with information obtained largely from primary sources, the people doing the research and producing new knowledge. This content is never meant to serve as medical advice. And with that, enjoy the episode.
Yeah. Well, I've essentially spent my name's Robert Lufkin. I've spent my whole career in academic medicine as a professor at a couple large medical schools here in Southern California. And being a professor, I was fortunate to be able to not only practice medicine, but also do research and also teach. So it's a great thing from that point of view. And I was basically represent the medical establishment. I'm not a conspiracy theorist or anything. I'm about as mainstream as they get. I mean, as an example, my publications, I have my specialty is medical imaging, although in the last 10 years, for reasons we'll probably get to, I've transitioned into metabolic health and longevity, largely out of self-interest. But my academic background is in medical imaging, and like I said, doing research. My laboratory took millions of dollars from, or was granted millions of dollars from the federal government, from drug companies, from equipment manufacturers. We did a lot of research, over 200 peer-reviewed publications, doing, all the things. I served as president of a couple international medical societies. So I'm really, I'm really mainstream medicine. And for the record, I believe that Western medicine is actually, it's unequaled in its ability to handle certain things. I'm not out to throw out Western medicine. I think, for example, if I have any number of infectious diseases, I'm going to go to Western medicine, and it's been very effective in the 20th century for eliminating public health diseases and really improving our lifespan. Similarly, if I step out in the street and I get hit by a bus, while lifestyle and nutrition may help me recover from that event, I will only survive that event if I have access to the latest cutting edge Western medicine, which will include blood transfusions, bone settings, and, surgery to reconnect my, whatever soft tissue damage I have. So Western medicine is really, in my opinion, unequaled in its ability to do those things. And the problem is when we apply those Western medicine approaches to certain diseases that we'll be talking about later. But anyway, that's my background. I still am a professor, although my focus, like I said, is now metabolic health and longevity.
And one thing that was interesting, so your new book that's coming out, you start out with a description of your mother. So can you kind of give that story to people? Who is your mother, and what was she doing in terms of diet and nutrition when you were growing up?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, all our mothers are formative in our lives, and our dads too. But it just so happened that my mom was a dietitian. She worked in hospitals all her life into her 80s, really, and so what that meant to me is growing up, we were exposed to the latest, the best healthcare recommendations as far as nutrition, which, for better or worse, at the time meant that we had essentially a low fat, high carbohydrate diet. We avoided things like butter because of saturated fat we thought was harmful, and we substituted what we thought was healthy, which was margarine, which is full of trans fats and seed oils. We we avoided fat on meat. We would trim off the fat on the corner of our meat, and we followed the food pyramid religiously. So the idea that food influenced our health was definitely imprinted on me. It just so happened that the wrong choices were I was subjected to many of the wrong foods growing up, as many people still are, because there's a lot of controversy and difference of opinions on what a good diet represents today.
Yeah, I mean, people get really impassioned about diet. There's almost a kind of religious zeal that many people have with their diet. They get really attached to certain diets. You've got vegans, you've got carnivores, you've got everything in between. So as a dietitian, where did your mother get her information and her training from? And how does that compare to a dietitian today?
Yeah, well, yeah, full disclosure, I think, I didn't think it at the time, but looking back, I realized that in her family, she had her brother and sister were both type 1 diabetics.
Mm,
So growing up, she was surrounded with the idea that, they should only eat certain foods because of their diabetes. So she was immersed in that. And I think that influenced her choices in her career. So she went to she went after college, she went to dietetics school, had training. She was certified by the American Dietetic Association. It's similar to what people have today in the same program. It's the same American Dietetic Association that was founded, at the turn of the century by actually a woman with very strong religious ties,
hmm.
but nothing against religion, but as a result of that, many people believe that this woman in the American Dietetic Association was influenced by a religious agenda, by eating certain foods and not eating other types of foods, which
What was
uh,
her religious beliefs?
Seventh-day Adventist.
Ah, okay. I didn't know that. And apparently
Yeah,
they were also influential in a lot of things, including the founding of various food companies.
yeah, Kellogg's
Yeah,
and yeah,
yeah.
and all those things. So there was things going on with that. And again, nothing against Seventh-day Adventists, nothing against any religion at all. It's just that for my health choices, I want them to be informed by what the science says, not what my particular choice of God says. And
Yeah, yeah.
that's just my belief, and everyone's entitled to their own belief. But I mean, that particular organization, the Adventists, has been very vocal about certain opinions about nutrition, and they've recently purchased a longevity brand. Dan Buettner popularized something called blue zones when he wrote a book.
Hmm.
You probably talked about this on your podcast about certain zones around the world where there are a large number of people who live over 100. There's centenarians, and
Yeah,
uh, and
yeah.
then they analyzed their lifestyle, their food choices, and everything. And there's some really beautiful work done with that. There's one in the United States, which happens to be Loma Linda, where where the Adventist church is, but then there are many other ones around the world. And I agree with many of the viewpoints of the blue zones, the idea of community, the idea of having purpose in your life, the idea that food dramatically influences your longevity and work and other factors as well. Even though the Blue Zones project itself has been called into question when they analyzed studies of centenarians based on these were typically. The other thing about the blue zones, these were typically lower socioeconomic areas. They were poorer areas, which typically tend to have poor birth records. So that was a possible criticism of it. And some reports have come out when the birth records have improved, the centenarian numbers went away. And another report came out when they analyzed the numbers of centenarians in the population, the birth dates of centenarians versus the birth dates of the general population. They were looking at statistical inferences and statistical tools, the way they track kind of fraud in income, fraud in financial statements,
so
and fraud in income tax.
I'm guessing you're about to say that the distribution of birthdays for the centenarians looked odd or not like a random sample.
That's right. The population as a whole, birth dates are random. The centenarians' birth dates were non-random. In other words, they tended to occur more on the first of the month or the end of the month. It was sort of days that people might pick if they didn't know. But so maybe the science isn't there, but I think we can still, there's good things about community and there's good take-home messages. One concerning thing is that the Blue Zone brand, which I guess is copyrighted now or trademarked, it's a whole industry, was just purchased by the Adventist organization, which again, nothing against Adventists, but it is driven by a religious rather than necessary scientific agenda. So it's going to be informing what people think is a scientific conclusion or something with a religious agenda.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things here is that it's important to understand, a lot of what we're going to talk about today has to do with things like mainstream medicine or medical institutions and the extent to which we should or shouldn't listen to them or how to look at them critically. One thing that's very important in that project, in my view, is understanding where an organization comes from, who founded it, what their prior beliefs or the conclusions they're coming to the table with are, and looking at how those change over time. And so, what you've already started to tell us is certain organizations out there have been seeded or started by people with religious beliefs. And again, nothing against religion, but another way of saying that is they were started by people who have preconceived conclusions that they are going to be interested in defending no matter what the evidence is, rather than coming at it from their perspective of seeing what all the evidence is and then tailoring their conclusions to that.
Absolutely. And as we'll probably talk about later, it's not just the blue zone or some of the diet that we're talking about, but also the scientific medical societies are, have similar corrupting influences as well.
Yeah. And so, so you said your mother was a dietitian. She had certain health issues in her family that probably motivated her to get really interested and diligent about her diet. She listened, right, to the organizations one would naturally look to. These are mainstream organizations. She became a dietitian. She probably learned a lot. She probably read a lot. And yet it sounded like you more or less said that she ended up getting everything wrong, or at least many things wrong. How is that possible? How is it that someone can study mainstream sources, they can look to mainstream institutions, and these institutions can tell us things for decades and decades that turn out to be so wrong in a pretty systematic way? Where does that, how can something that systematically wrong last for so many years?
I mean, that's a great question, and we're still facing it today in all aspects of society, but particularly in healthcare. I guess I have to say that I'm enough of a believer in human nature that I believe that nobody or very few people get up wanting to harm another person. In other words, and certainly healthcare
Hmm.
providers and doctors, and that they don't go into that business to harm people and make choices that are going to be unhealthy, but layered on top of that, I think are incredible, unimaginably strong, pernicious influences, both conscious and unconscious, financial and otherwise, that manipulate our system to the point now where the mainstream health organizations and many of my colleagues still give advice that is harmful for patients and actually will make them have a greater risk for chronic diseases. If they have the chronic diseases, it will make them worse and ultimately likely shorten their longevity.
Hmm. So let's just pick one chronic disease and talk about that to start with. And we can kind of use that to unpack bigger issues, I think. Let's start with type 2 diabetes. So, I've talked about this subject in different ways on the podcast a number of times with a number of different experts. Type 2 diabetes. Can you summarize briefly what that is for people and give us a sense for how big the problem is today compared to, say, when you were growing up?
Yeah, I mean, diabetes as a disease has been around for thousands of years. It was described in, ancient Roman texts and everything. And typically it's a disorder of, it's thought of as a disorder of glucose metabolism. And the original type of diabetes is what's called type 1 diabetes, and where insulin, which is a hormone I'm sure you've talked about with your guests, is produced in the pancreas
Hmm.
that regulates many things in our body, but also protects us from high levels of glucose in our bloodstream. So people with type 1 diabetes for uh, somewhat unknown reasons. They may have an immune response or some source of damage to their pancreas. They're unable to make insulin, and therefore they can't regulate their glucose, and they will die of it. Um, when glucose was introduced in the 20th century, it was life-saving for these people and really transformed the lives of these people. There was another type of diabetes that is also called diabetes. It's called type 2 diabetes. And though it's called diabetes, it's very different from type 1. Although a lot of people sort of confuse them or lump them together because they both have the same name, diabetes, and they both deal with insulin abnormalities.
Hmm.
But where type 1 diabetes is a problem of too little insulin, type 2 diabetes is a problem of the body developing what's called insulin resistance. So it doesn't respond to the insulin, and it requires greater and greater levels of insulin to manage the sugar levels. And it used to be type 1 diabetes was fairly uncommon, and it was used to be called adult onset diabetes because type 2 diabetes oftentimes, type 1 diabetes oftentimes, not always, but would occur in childhood.
Hmm.
And then type 2 diabetes would be this adult onset form.
Yeah, I mean, I remember even in my childhood when I first learned about these terms, I learned it as type 1 is childhood diabetes, type 2 is adult diabetes, and of course, as I think you're going to tell us, that's changed so drastically over time because so many people, including young people, are now getting type 2 diabetes that phrasing doesn't even make sense anymore.
Yes, something happened in the last 30 years, 30 to 40 years, really, and nobody really knows what it is. There's some very strong candidates for what it might be, but basically our health began to go off the rails. People began first of all, the obesity rates began to skyrocket to the point today where most adults in the United States are either obese or overweight.
Mhm.
And it didn't always used to be that way. It happened fairly recently, and that of course, if you have any doubts that obesity is not a genetic condition in most people, just look at the rates. It's exploding. If it were, genes don't change, it's the same genetics, but the rates are exploding. Well, about 10 years after the obesity rates started going through the roof like this, we're now seeing the diabetic rates going through the roof. And these are not unrelated for reasons we can talk about, but now diabetes is dramatically exploding to the point that we are in the largest epidemic of diabetes in recorded history, even corrected for population. In other words, more people have diabetes per person per population than ever before in history. And the interesting thing, the type of diabetes that they have, by far 90% or more, is type 2 diabetes. It didn't used to be that way. And it's no longer adult onset necessarily. We have children who are type 2 diabetics and many other conditions and many other indicators like this. So we're undergoing a major revolution in diabetes that didn't happen before, and it's largely this type 2 diabetes. And the problem with type 2 diabetes is it's really, as I mentioned, it's due to insulin resistance. But this insulin resistance and the associated inflammation associated with it, which means metabolic abnormalities, these things also happen to drive other chronic diseases like hypertension, like an arthritis called gout. Diabetics get cardiovascular disease at a much higher rate. That's heart attacks and strokes. Diabetics get cancer at a much higher rate, just like obese people do. Obesity is now replacing tobacco as the number one environmental risk factor for cancer. And diabetes is also right up there. Alzheimer's disease is now referred to as type 3 diabetes because of the strong associations with inflammation, insulin resistance, and degenerative neural diseases, which the main one is Alzheimer's disease. And this actually even extends to things like mental health, psychiatric conditions, where we're seeing that these same metabolic abnormalities also, which manifest as type 2 diabetes in some people, and some people may not. It's not just type 2 diabetics that get these, but they may not manifest as a type 2 diabetic. They may only get Alzheimer's, or they may only get schizophrenia, or they may only get something else. But the point is, all these factors seem to have common metabolic causes that, unfortunately, Western medicine, as we know it now, really doesn't have a treatment for these underlying causes. In other words, we have a pill or surgery. Let's say if I get a heart attack, God forbid you or I have a heart attack, which means we don't get blood flow to our heart. We'll likely today get a stent put in our blood vessel, which is a mechanical device that opens the blood vessel. And for many people, they'll have the heart attack and they'll go, wow, thank God I got the stent. It saved my life. I'm done. My heart disease is taken care of. And they go home. And what they don't realize is the stent does nothing to change your survival from heart disease. It does nothing to slow down the disease. And the disease actually continues in other blood vessels. And even in the stent itself will eventually clot off. But this model, this misconception that we see in heart disease is also true in, I suggest, in hypertension as well. I mean, my blood pressure may be elevated. I take a pill to lower it. My blood pressure is lowered, but the damage to my blood vessels continues to go on. Similarly, with diabetes, again, with type 2 diabetes, where people are given doses of insulin to control their insulin resistance, there have been a number of studies shown that tight regulation of the sugar, the blood glucose with insulin in type 2 diabetics does nothing, or does, in many cases, very little to control the downstream effects of the diabetes, which, all the diseases I mentioned, plus diabetes is the number one cause of surgical amputations today. It's the number one cause of renal failure and dialysis. It's the number one cause of blindness. It goes on and on and on. And many of these complications still happen even when the patient's getting the insulin. They go, I'm a diabetic, but it's taken care of. I've got the insulin.
Right.
Instead, they're ignoring things that they can do to actually address these basic metabolic conditions that, for a number of reasons, I don't think are known enough or popularized enough by Western medicine as solutions for metabolic disease and all these conditions, rather than using just Band-Aids like pills and surgery.
Where does type 2 diabetes, or more generally, where does insulin resistance come from to begin with? What are some of the major lifestyle factors that drive its development?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when I talk about insulin resistance, something that kind of blew me away, that I wasn't aware of until I really started diving into the subject, is type 2 diabetes, as we've talked about, is insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is measured by a number of blood tests, but one of the most common ones is the hemoglobin A1C. You've probably talked about it with your audience. It's a measure literally of glycation damage to red blood cells from high glucose levels in your bloodstream. And once it goes above 6.5, then the medical system makes that a diagnostic criteria for diabetes. When it's below 6.5, I might be pre-diabetic, but I'm not diabetic. So it's kind of an either or switch. And I used to think of diabetes and indeed all these chronic diseases as sort of either on and off switches. Either I was diabetic or I wasn't diabetic, or I had Alzheimer's or I didn't have Alzheimer's. And what I've come to appreciate now, based on, in the case of diabetes, there's a large study that came out recently where they looked at non-diabetic adults, and it was based on the Framingham data, the NHANES data, a large number of people. And they tracked this marker for diabetes, this marker of insulin resistance, this hemoglobin A1C, and they looked at it versus the age of the person. And as people got older and older, their HA1C goes up and up and up and up and up like that. So what does that mean? Well, when I saw that, to me, it means that even though I'm not diabetic now, insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes may be something like gray hair. In other words, it's in my future. If I don't die of something else sooner, I will eventually get gray hair, And that caused me to look at the lifestyle choices I was making now differently, because maybe I ought to pay attention to the foods that diabetics shouldn't eat, because I'm really on the path to insulin resistance and diabetes.
And so how do we think about the foods that diabetics should eat or stop eating to help with their diabetes, / the foods we should eat or avoid to prevent ourselves from getting diabetes? If I look at, for example, the American Diabetes Association, very large, very well-funded association that's been around for decades, that's specifically focused on diabetes, they tell me to eat things like whole grains and legumes and other things. And then other people are telling me completely different things. So there's a lot of confusion out there because you get different people telling you very different things. Sometimes these are people at large institutions. Sometimes these are people with credentials. Sometimes it's other people, but there's a lot of mixed messaging out there. How do you think about diet and insulin resistance?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great point. It's so confusing for you and I to talk about this, and we focus on this, all the time. You imagine kind of a average person who's just trying to do their job and raise their kids, and then, you get all this information about what is good and what is not good. And so we all try and simplify things. So we go to organizations like the American Diabetes Association, which is the leading healthcare organization in the United States that is looked upon worldwide for healthy advice about diabetes. And as we mentioned earlier, these medical institutions, as many of them, including this one, you have to look at their influences. Who is paying for their advice? And their advice is not only to eat whole grains. On their website, even to this day, they advocate recipes which have added sugar. And
Yeah.
we talk about, well, I don't think that's good, but they just say, oh, just cover it with insulin. And if you look at who's funding the American Diabetic Association, you can look and you'll see companies like DaVita. What is DaVita? Well, it's one of the most largest dialysis companies that makes renal dialysis equipment. What's the number one cause of renal dialysis and renal failure in the world? Type 2 diabetes. So the company
So,
that
so
makes
the more people that are type 2 diabetic, the more kidney failure you're going to see. The more kidney failure, the more people that need dialysis. The more people that need dialysis, the more dialysis machines DaVita is going to sell.
Yeah, I mean that's a very cynical way of looking at it, but why else would American Diabetic Association put recipes on their website that
Mhm.
that, as we'll talk about, contain foods that will
Yeah.
drive up your insulin and
Yeah.
make your diabetes worse?
Well, another thing that's confusing to me as I think about this is why exactly is DaVita advertising with them? Are there consumers out there shopping around for different brand name kidney dialysis machines and picking that one?
No, they're not.
Yeah.
To be clear, they're not advertising. They're sponsoring them. So
What's the
they're if
what's the
you if you look on the website for, I mean, the American Diabetes Association, I believe, is a nonprofit. Most of these are
Yep.
nonprofits, so they get sponsors, not so much to run ads, but well, if you think about it,
What
if I'm a
exactly?
diabetic,
Yeah.
I'm going to need dialysis, so I could go to the DaVita Center instead of the XYZ Center, perhaps.
I see. So maybe it's like a psychological association thing that they're hoping to achieve.
Yeah. Yeah, and that it may be as benign as that, but I don't, I'm suspicious because I'm trying to figure out why the American Diabetic Association would make such recommendations, in my opinion, that
Yeah.
that are not
Oh yeah.
healthy.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen. You can go online. They have essentially a big recipe page with all sorts of foods, and there's everything in there from chocolate chips with honey nut Cheerios or some brand of Cheerios that I'm sure they technically recommend because it's multi-grain, quote unquote. There's added sugar inside of orange juice based drinks. There's a lot of really sugary stuff in there, and it is peculiar. I think no matter who you are, it's certainly peculiar.
Yeah, you don't have to be a nutrition scientist or a physician to think, whoa, this really doesn't make sense. Knowing what we know about diabetes, why are you recommending patients take this from this trusted source?
Mhm. And so, with respect to sugar and carbohydrates more generally, how do you think about diabetes? Is the best approach for someone with prediabetes or diabetes to go low carb? Is it something else? What's sort of the macronutrient framework that you use to think about diabetes?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question. The early treatment of diabetes before insulin was to um, was to go on a very, very low carbohydrate diet. Why is that? Of the three macronutrients, fat and protein are essential for life. In other words, if we don't eat fats or proteins, we'll die. Interestingly, the third macronutrient is not required for life, and there are populations of humans that, survive on relatively little carbohydrates, and There are even diets that are extremely low carbohydrate diets. The interesting thing is these three macronutrients affect insulin very differently because insulin, one of its primary roles is to protect the body from damage from glucose, high glucose levels. So the number one factor, the number one driver of insulin of the three macronutrients by far is carbohydrates. Fat and protein have relatively little or no influence on insulin. So if you think about it, if I have a problem with insulin resistance, which is people believe it's due to chronically higher and higher levels of insulin and inflammation that make the body just respond less and less to the insulin. So I require higher doses. It's like the boy who cried wolf. You keep needing, you have to cry louder and louder. So so basically the insulin, higher amounts of insulin are necessary to fulfill the requirements for this type 2 diabetes. And so if you want to minimize the insulin that's produced, and there are a number of reasons why we want to reduce the amount of insulin that's produced, not just for diabetes, but for other factors like cancer and other things, then our dietary choices would be to avoid the things that drive insulin, and those are largely carbohydrates. There are two other food processes that, in my opinion, can also drive insulin resistance, but the primary effect on insulin itself, like high levels of insulin, is from the carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm. What are those two other processes?
Well, one of them is another sugar, but it's an interesting sugar. It's called fructose. Fructose is the very sweet sugar. It's the sweetest sugar of all. It's found in fructose. It's also half of the sucrose molecule, which is the table sugar we eat, which is half glucose and half fructose. Fructose, interestingly, doesn't have a significant effect on insulin. So if I take insulin, if I take glucose, my insulin will go up. If I take fructose, there's very little effect. And this, to the point that the American Diabetic Association for many years recommended fructose as a sugar for diabetics because it wouldn't spike their insulin, which was true. What they didn't realize, though, and what really we're just beginning to realize in the last 10 years is that fructose is actually, it's in high doses is a toxin. And while glucose is metabolized by essentially almost all the cells of the body, fructose is really only metabolized to any significant extent by our detoxification organ, which is the liver.
It's sort of like alcohol in that sense?
Exactly. And so many of the same diseases are driven, the number one cause of liver failure or the number one cause of fatty liver used to be alcoholic fatty liver disease. Then in 1980, for reasons that, are not completely clear, but they're strong suspects, in 1980, there was a new liver disease that suddenly appeared that was called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, to the point that today, 30 years later, it's totally replaced alcoholic fatty liver disease. It's the number one cause of liver failure and the number one cause of liver transplants. And in some studies, 50% of adult Americans have this.
So is a way to think about this that fructose is not metabolized by all the cells of our body. So it's not like glucose, which, glucose can be used by all of our cells to power ATP synthesis and energy production. Fructose is only metabolized in the liver. So if you have a lot of fructose in your diet, you're sort of just generally stressing out the liver a little bit more.
Yeah. And it's not only metabolized in the liver. About 10% or a small amount is metabolized in the digestion system, in the intestines.
I see.
And you might think about this as, well, this is sort of the normal amount that's expected is metabolized there. Anything above that is considered, one way as a toxin, and
I see.
it goes
and that's
to
why
the
it
liver.
goes to the liver. Okay.
Yeah, the liver is a detoxification organ, but as it detoxifies, it stores fat in the liver, which causes fatty liver disease. It also drives insulin resistance. It doesn't elevate the insulin directly, but it drives inflammation, which drives insulin resistance.
Mm.
It also affects things like uric acid, which was a chemical like fructose we didn't pay much attention to for many years. It was associated with gout and things, but now we see that urate is actually linked to fructose metabolism, and it's tightly linked to metabolic health. It's also linked to nitric oxide synthase, and urate levels affect that. And nitric oxide, of course, is an amazing molecule. They won the Nobel Prize for it, but it does three things that are fundamental. It increases blood vessels, the glycothelial endocalyx. It allows it to relax, which means it controls hypertension, erectile dysfunction, but all the other functions. Nitric oxide also independently drives the immune system and for immune health. And then, as if that weren't enough, independent of those two things, and independent of the effect of blood vessels on the brain, it actually improves neuronal function as well. So fructose drives all these factors downstream through urate, through nitric oxide synthetase that have all these effects on our health.
So one thing that was really interesting to me is I was sort of reading about the history of diabetes and insulin resistance, the discovery of insulin, the founding of the ADA, some of the old lifestyle interventions they used to do before we knew about insulin, up through to the present day. And one of the founders, actually, so the ADA was founded by some physicians, and one of the founders actually had something he called the starch-free diet. And if you go back and read it, this is all the way back from 1921. It's essentially an ultra low carb diet. Avoid breads, avoid sugar in any form. It says explicitly. But then just a little bit after that, insulin was discovered, and then it kind of just became the thing that was used because you could, inject someone with insulin if they were having a blood sugar episode, and that would acutely help the problem. And it sort of looked like the idea of using diet and lifestyle changes just sort of faded into the background now that we had this medicine that could be injected to solve an acute problem. And then, as you get into the 60s and 70s, the ADA starts recommending initially something like 50-60% carbohydrates in terms of your percentage of calories. And we see them, following the USDA guidelines, the things that mirror the food pyramid. I'm just wondering what your take is on that sort of evolutionary progression. What was it that caused us to go from, in the early 20th century, a focus on diet, a focus on macronutrients, to then this focus on insulin, and then this focus on high carbohydrate diets? What was driving all of that? Was all of it just a response to what we thought was true based on the science and the research that was being conducted? Or is that one of a number of different kinds of influences?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to say it's not only limited to diabetes and insulin. There are other diseases that had sort of lifestyle dietary treatments that worked great for that. When some sort of pharmacological intervention came along and they could take a pill instead, that the excuse me, the effects of the diets fell out of use. And the great example of that is epilepsy. It used to be that again, since Greek and Roman times, it was known that to control seizures, what you do is you fast and you stop eating, or you go on a diet that simulates fasting, which is a ketogenic diet, it's called, which is, no surprise, very low carbs. And it means there's very little glucose that's eaten. Instead, you're eating fat and protein, and it switches the body, as you probably talked about, into ketosis, which is an alternative, and some people argue more healthier form of metabolism. And for many years, up until the beginning of the 20th century, this was the treatment for epilepsy. You put people on a ketogenic diet, and their seizures go away. And then in early 20th century, anti-seizure medicines were developed, sodium valproate and other number of medicines. And people began, hey, I'd rather take the pill and then I can eat whatever I want. And fast forward to today, where the whole idea of treating seizures up until, let's say, 10 years ago with ketogenic diet wasn't available. And there were, and how bad it got is that there's some patients, some kids, adults who have seizures, and it doesn't, their seizures don't respond to any medicines. So they're non-responsive to medical therapy. These patients then can undergo surgery in some cases where they'll actually resect parts of the brain that may be causing the seizures. And there's one story that he's a wealthy filmmaker from Los Angeles who had a child with uncontrolled seizures that they tried all the medicines, none of the medicines worked. And I think they had surgery or they considered surgery. Nothing worked. Anyway, long story short, this individual was wealthy enough. He was able to take his child around the world looking at all different treatments. And he finally found a physician, I think somewhere on the East Coast at Johns Hopkins, I think, who is an older guy who still practiced ketogenic therapy for seizures. And anyway, he put the child on ketogenic therapy, and basically with a ketogenic diet, all the seizures went away. And now this person he made a movie about this, and he's donated, millions of dollars to advance this. So it's happened before in many different areas. Why does it happen? Or back to your question, what drives it? I think at one level, it's just a basic thing. I know I'm lazy. I'd rather take a pill than change the way I live my life and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's human nature that, given a short option, because if the thing about taking a pill or even surgery is I don't have to change who I am. In other words, even a surgery, I might miss a week's worth of work and I go to sleep for a while, but then I go back and I still am the same way. On the other hand, to make a lifestyle change, I literally have to change the way I look at life, change the way I eat.
Some kind of identity transformation.
Exactly. And that's much more difficult to do. It's an investment of myself rather than just saying, hey, I went to the doctor, they gave me a pill. It's not my problem. I took the pill, So well, I think there's that. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. Like people often feel like they're losing something if they change their lifestyle. I can think of a lot of people in my own life that are very much like that. It's not simply that you're asking them to give up sugary foods or give up beer or give up, whatever it may be, but there's so many memories and social context that all of those things are associated with. And, it's not that people are just like, I want to eat sugar, period. It's that is attached to all of these things that are, really, really nice parts about life, birthday parties with birthday cake and having a drink with your friends after work. And like all of that sort of social, emotional stuff, that psychology is bundled up with all of these foods that we eat.
And even on a darker side, but echoing the same thing, are the addictions, the addictive nature of some of these behaviors that, that are based on what's happened like you say, in our life experiences, our childhood trauma. We've all had childhood trauma. Just being a child is traumatic. It influences the way we look at things and then influences our choices. And that's why sometimes just telling a person, you can either give up carbohydrates as a diabetic or you can take insulin, but eventually you're going to lose your toes and your kidneys and and that person will still, choose the latter because even though they understand the risks of the sugar, there are other influences. And that's why it's fascinating how powerful then community becomes, or coaching programs, or even there's a drug called naltrexone, which is a physical addiction drug that you give for people with physical addictions. Well, there's now an off-label use of it called low-dose naltrexone, where it's a low-dose maintenance dose, but it helps people get off junk food and kind of change their lifestyle, change their behavioral things that are so unhealthy and that are harming them. So it's many layers on how this stuff works.
Yeah. But I mean, when you're truly addicted to something like that, it is often difficult or even arguably impossible for someone to use mere willpower to come off of that, especially when they're in a social context like our society where, everything from social interaction to, festivals and birthdays and holidays, they're all wrapped up in this type of food environment. We started out talking about, the Seventh-day Adventists towards the beginning, and they have religious beliefs about diet that are motivating them to pursue certain things. What do you think, sort of on a higher level, given the role that religion plays in people's lives and has for many thousands of years, do you think it's a coincidence that most major religious traditions have a lot of taboos and strong beliefs related to things like diet and fasting? Does it require something that strong and that tied to identity and culture to actually successfully motivate people to really regulate their diet in strict ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think, as Jason Fung famously said, what's the one thing that Muhammad, the Buddha, Jesus, whoever religious leaders, the one thing they all agree on, and it's not a spiritual concept at all. It's the fact that fasting is healthy. It's a healthy thing to do. But I think that the fact that they have all those religious regulations about food reflect a knowledge that food is truly powerful, and it's one of the most powerful medicines we have. That all the recommendations may not be beneficial anymore today, or they may be based on older concepts like public health things with pork and or things like that. But it does reflect, I think, that religions as institutions understand the power of food and nutrition and the importance for our health.
Yeah, it's sort of amazing that, if you just look back at history, it's kind of obvious actually. Like most successful cultures that lasted a long time, most world religions that actually have sustained themselves, they have very clear traditions around fasting. The Muslims have Ramadan, Catholics have Lent, many Hindus and Buddhists have, it's like your entire life you're fasting, at least from certain foods. And it's probably not a coincidence. It's like none of these people knew about the gut microbiome, 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. None of them knew about the physiology of fasting, and yet they all converged on similar strategies around regulating diet.
Yeah, I mean, you might think that so a lot of people with even short fasts experience a real clarity of mind and a different mindset and perspective on the world. So they may have recognized this and suggested it as a tool for if not spiritual enlightenment, at least enhanced introspection and self-observation and everything with it. That's an interesting thought, I guess.
Going back to the ketogenic diet, so you mentioned a little bit about the history of the ketogenic diet with respect to epilepsy. It's been known for a long time that fasting and going into ketosis can be effective at helping with at least certain forms of epilepsy. What's your general view on the ketogenic diet today, more generally speaking, for people who are interested in weight loss or people with metabolic syndrome, diabetes, things like that? Is the ketogenic diet viable? Is it something they should think about? Is it just a fad? Is it dangerous? What are your general thoughts there?
Yeah. And before I get into that, I would like to make a disclaimer and sort of referencing back your prior comment about how diet choices today have become politicized, like
Mm.
everything in our lives. Republicans don't speak with Democrats anymore, and it's just gotten so crazy. And there's definitely a polarization between people, let's say, who eat entire plants or eat only plants or are plant-based, so sort of the vegan, vegetarian side versus other groups of people who eat only animals and carnivores and all that. And let me say that I love my vegan friends. I love my carnivore friends. I used to be a vegan for many years. I've been a carnivore for many years. I've tried it all. I drank the Kool-Aid. And personally, I think it's possible to be very healthy or very unhealthy on either of those extremes and anything in between. So it's not it's not one of those, it's not either or on those, but it's about the choices we make within the framework of those. And I think it comes down to avoiding certain types of foods. And frankly, I know from experience as a vegan, there's a lot more junk food, harmful vegan, vegetarian foods, plant-based foods than there are animal-based foods. There's still animal-based junk foods that, in my opinion, are unhealthy, but it's more of a minefield when I'm eating plant-based. I really have to pay attention.
Yeah, I mean, because there's so many things out there that are marketed as healthy. It'll say plant-based, gluten-free, this, that, or the other. It's got a bunch of vitamins that it's been fortified with, but it's filled with added sugar and or soybean oil and or all of these other things that a lot of people, I mean, people, this is changing, I think, but a lot of people still don't realize that they should be looking at those things as well when they look at the ingredients list. They think, oh, it's got low calories and some vitamin C, B, and whatever, and so it must be good.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the nature of the beast. Most junk food is heavily weighted towards plant-based, but there are animal junk foods, like I said. I mean, if you look at the food pyramid, which was advanced for a couple of decades as recommendations for healthy eating for the United States, but it was copied around the world. Basically, it was amplified to everyone.
Mhm.
Recently, it's come out the people who designed the food pyramid, Nina Teicholz and other people, have come up with reporting that shows their ties to big food and their financial interests. That when you look at them, you realize that, wow, the people who came up with this healthy eating plan were actually strongly funded by organizations that make a lot of junk food. But on the other hand, if you look at the food pyramid, the bottom line of the food pyramid is what you're supposed to eat the most of. And then as you go up, you eat less and less and less. Well, the bottom line of the food pyramid is all junk food. It's basically cereals, grains, all that kind of stuff. So it makes perfect sense when you consider who the people were who, advanced this agenda.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about how things like the USDA guidelines get set, how things like the food pyramid were constructed. You just started to get into it, but one way to look at the whole history of the guidelines and what some of these major institutions have said over the years is, well, maybe they're just following the science. We don't know everything. We've learned a lot over the last 10, 20, 30, 50 years, and our views are just slowly being updated as people pay attention to new research. An alternative view might be that, well, if we look back at the construction of the food pyramid or the founding of some of these organizations, it wasn't merely that they looked at all of the research that was out there and had a holistic view and an objective view of it, but they were actually cherry picking the information. They were influenced by their sponsors and other influences. So to what extent do you think it's the first way to view history there versus the second way? To what extent are things like the guidelines constructed from a holistic and objective and dispassionate view of the totality of the research that's out there versus being constructed in other ways?
Yeah, I think it's the former. I think they were filtered through the lens of one, financial interests of big food, but also they were filtered through the lens of what was thought to be the best practices for healthy eating. And this was driven since the 1960s by a fear of heart disease. And this fear of heart disease was based on in my opinion, sort of the mistaken concept that the main drivers for heart disease were dietary cholesterol and dietary saturated fats. So it began a whole industry of a low-fat diet. People lived. I lived through a time when foods were made low fat, and so the sort of the snack well phenomenon. A cookie was made low fat, the fat was removed, and sugar was added. Yogurt is made low fat, the fat's removed, and sugar is added. So it was replacing fat in our food with what people thought was healthy was sugar. But that evidence has come forward that some people knew that sugar was a problem. People Harvard, the Department of Nutrition, were, caught receiving funds from the sugar lobby that were not reported, that then they wrote articles that, held up this flawed fat hypothesis. Even till even till today, we're still seeing the effects of that. Gerald Raven, a great scientist from Stanford, who developed the understanding of syndrome X, or metabolic syndrome, the idea that that hypertension is linked to obesity, is linked to dyslipidemia, and linked to insulin resistance. He recognized that at the end of the 20th century. The only problem was he realized that what drove metabolic syndrome was not fat in the diet, but it was actually just the opposite. It was sugar in the diet. And so his research didn't get the attention it needed because it went against the mainstream belief that fat is bad. We're slowly unraveling that. Today, we know that even the most conservative medical institutions now admit that dietary cholesterol has no significant effect on body cholesterol. So we can eat as many eggs as we want. In fact, I consider a hard-boiled egg one of the healthiest things we can eat. It's like nature's Ozempic. But so the point is that there was this narrative of fat being evil that influenced the food pyramid, as well as all the junk food manufacturers as well, I think.
So in terms of saturated fat and cholesterol, you said dietary cholesterol doesn't really affect blood cholesterol levels. I think, you're certainly not the first person to say that. A lot of people have noticed that firsthand. I eat a lot of eggs. I have a lot of dietary cholesterol, and my cholesterol levels are not high. What is your general view on saturated versus polyunsaturated fats, and what should people be thinking about there?
Yeah. There's a whole discussion to your question that dietary cholesterol doesn't affect serum cholesterol. The whole question then is, does serum cholesterol matter? How important is that in heart disease? But we can come back to that. But what was your other question about?
Just saturated versus poly. So
Yeah.
sort of one of the dominant narratives out there, certainly among a lot of mainstream institutions, is still that you should limit saturated fat intake, because saturated fat, as you can probably tell us, is linked to serum levels of cholesterol. And so that's one piece of what we can talk about. But that you should replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats, often described as heart healthy plant-based fats.
Yeah. In addition to avoiding of the three pillars of my diet, the first one is avoiding carbohydrates and starches and sugars in carbohydrates. The second pillar is avoiding something called seed oils, which are industrial oils, which are ultra processed oils, high in omega-6, that have a high inflammatory nature, and in my opinion can drive insulin resistance. Kate Shanahan has written a great deal about that and has a new book coming out on the subject. So when I was growing up, my mom, as a dietitian, when we want to pop popcorn, instead of popping it in butter, we would pop it either in margarine, or later on we would use vegetable oil, canola oil. Again, this, in my opinion, is unhealthy. But if I go to the American Heart Association now, another, A-list, first-tier medical association associated with a particular disease, the American Heart Association, on their website, recommends canola as a heart-healthy oil. Again, you have to wonder why that would be. And of course, you look at the history of seed oils. They were these industrial oils. They're really not made from vegetables, but they're called vegetable oils. But the industrial oils were developed famously in the beginning of the 20th century by German scientists. Initially, they were trying to come up with a better lubricant for U-boats, for their submarines. And they came up with something that was Crisco, basically. It was a warm thing that people could eat. And they said, well, why don't we feed it to people? So they sold it to Procter and Gamble. Procter and Gamble branded it as Crisco. And Procter and Gamble also gave a very large grant to a fledgling heart society, which was the American Heart Association, and kind of got them started in there. So it's complicated. Vegetable oils will lower serum cholesterol in some patients. So there, you could make that argument, but personally, I believe that the harm from inflammation and insulin resistance is much greater in these seed oils than any possible benefit. And I think that serum cholesterol, while it plays a factor in heart attacks, it's not the biggest factor, and it's not the factor that we should be paying the most attention to. I mean, most people, when they show up in an emergency room, have normal serum cholesterol. Show up in an emergency room with a heart attack, have normal serum cholesterol. So metabolic factors like insulin resistance, markers of that, A1C, inflammation, triglycerides, HDL, these reflect metabolic health. And these have a much greater hazard ratio, which is a predictive factor for heart disease and health. And I think we need to pay more attention to that. The take-home message should be, you're more likely to die from a heart attack if you eat, a lot of sugar than if you eat a lot of saturated fat. And I don't think that message is getting out there.
In terms of total serum cholesterol levels, if you look at, say, the relationship between total cholesterol and all-cause mortality, there's a nonlinear relationship there, at least from the data I've seen. Your risk of all-cause mortality can go up if your cholesterol levels get too high. It can also go up if they get too low. So what do we know about cholesterol levels and how we think about too high, too low, and where that Goldilocks zone is?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think cholesterol, like just almost every other metabolic marker in our body, everything else we do, there's a sweet spot, and too much of it is bad and has harmful effects, and too little of it is bad and has harmful effects. I don't think that the lower the better in cholesterol, as some people advocate, is good. And as you mentioned, there's some very large studies now. One that just came out with 60, it's a meta-analysis of 60 trials of statins, which, as you know, is a drug that lowers cholesterol and serum cholesterol. And what they showed was that people who took statins in many of the populations, their chance of dying of a heart attack decreased. And it actually, it was not a huge amount. It was about, 1% or so, which is consistent across the statins. But hey, the number one killer for you and me, and the thing that will determine the longevity of us and most of our audience, will be heart disease. So I'll take a 1% bonus anyway, just for taking a pill. The problem with statins and the problem with this approach is that, well, first of all, statins have a lot of side effects, and they, can have muscle side effects, brain fog, memory issues, many, many other side effects. But even more ominously, as you mentioned, is when we look at all-cause mortality, specifically in these very, very large studies, an interesting thing happens. People who take statins, 1% or less had, lower all-cause mortality from heart attacks, but they actually had increased mortality from other diseases, which meant in the aggregate, there was no difference. In other words, their all-cause mortality didn't change. And then you go, well, that's weird. What did they die of, And so when you look at the data, they go, well, suicides, automobile accidents, other things. You go, well, how could statins cause that? Well, our brain is made up of cholesterol. And when we have, too little cholesterol, which is happening with statins for some patients, and maybe for all patients, there are effects on the brain that that can affect the way we think and the way we
Yeah.
behave. And there were other causes of death too that changed. But the whole thing with statins is really problematic. It was a great drug for many years when people believed that cholesterol was the cause of heart disease. Great, here's a drug, it'll lower the cholesterol. Now we're understanding it's more nuanced, that and maybe they're not such a great drug. Some people are even saying that the benefit of statins isn't really the effect on LDL cholesterol. And there's been evidence to show that too, that the amount you lower the LDL cholesterol doesn't affect your chance of the heart attack. The people who have better heart attacks aren't necessarily the ones who lower their cholesterol the most. So some people are saying, well, what's the effect then? And they're saying, well, it's anti-inflammatory, possibly.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just so much we don't know on this, but our knowledge is evolving rapidly, which is exciting.
Mm-hmm. So, a lot of the things that we've talked about, or that we could talk about, that are related or show similar themes are, if you just look at the history of Western medicine, there's a recurring pattern is we develop something like a drug that makes a particular marker we're interested in go up or down. We think we know enough about the surrounding biology that we should use that as a tool to make our marker go in the direction we want. And yet, later on, at least, we realize, okay, there's a lot more to the biology than we realized at the time. So when do we know when we know enough to use these types of interventions? So, for example, I'm just going to pick one example, but I could pick pretty much any drug here. We just developed these drugs fairly recently. They've become popular very recently for weight loss, called GLP-1 agonists, like Ozempic. How do we, like, if we step back and we look at Ozempic and how the drug works and what we know about the surrounding biology, what can we point to that tells us whether or not we understand enough of the biology to mass produce and mass distribute this?
That is the question, isn't it? Well, let me again say that I don't believe there are situations in medicine, aside from a blood transfusion or a fracture, I think there are diseases where a single drug can be life-saving and can make a difference. Like type 1 diabetes. It's very hard to control type 1 diabetes purely on dietary basis. So insulin for type 1 diabetics is life-saving. I mean,
because they have absolutely no ability to make insulin, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a spectrum. I mean, different people have different amounts, but yeah, in full-blown case, there may be no insulin at all. And if somebody has no insulin, they will die because of the blood sugar issues. But an even more dramatic example in the news recently was a disease that has a single genetic mutation called sickle cell anemia, or largely a single defective hemoglobin molecule. And we know it very clearly. People who have this hemoglobin molecule defect, the red blood cells crinkle in their bloodstream, and then they clot in their joints. They cause pain. They can cause strokes. It's a terrible disease, sickle cell anemia. And you might wonder why does this gene even exist in the population? There's a gene for sickling the hemoglobin, which carries the oxygen in our blood, and it causes pain and strokes, and people die with it. Why doesn't the gene just die off and go away? Well, it's always interesting to ask that question. For sickle cell anemia, of course, the answer is it provided a survival advantage for patients exposed to malaria, which used to be endemic in certain tropical zones. And when the people with sickle cell disease didn't get the malaria because the blood would sickle, and they would have a much better survival. So there was that advantage. And you could ask the same thing about ApoE4, as the mutation for Alzheimer's and heart disease, or you could ask it about, other factors. And they're fascinating stories with each one of those. But But anyway, these effects can be dramatic with sickle cell disease. But recently there was with CRISPR therapy and gene therapy, there was recently a new gene therapy product that's, if you want to call it a drug, it's a drug, but you give it once to patients with sickle cell anemia, and it basically changes their DNA so that this is replaced in their genome so that they no longer have sickle cell anemia for their life. So it's kind of a problem for the drug companies because it's a drug that you only give once, you only give one dose. So they had to come up with a pricing to make sense. So now they charge $2 million a dose for it.
Whoa.
But for someone with sickle cell anemia, it's life-saving. So I guess, long story, the point is there are some medicines that actually work for, certain diseases like that are life-saving.
For diseases that are more chronic and they don't have, a single gene cause or something that pinpointable, I think what you would probably agree to is that, we should really think more on the prevention side and helping people live a life that's conducive to never even developing some of these things to begin with. So for something like metabolic syndrome and all of the things that would cluster with that, obesity, diabetes, and so forth, if you want to avoid that chronic illness in your life, what are the major things you should think about with respect to diet in particular?
Yeah, great question. And let me reframe it a little bit too, because my viewpoint on this changed a little bit, because prevention, sometimes it's a tough sell for people. It's like, hey, I'm going to prevent something I'm going to get in 20 years. Look, I'm busy with other stuff. I've got more important things right now on the table. Well, now I don't look at it as prevention so much. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier. In other words, the type 2 diabetes, the insulin resistance, maybe it's an on-off switch in my doctor's office. In other words, she will tell me, one day I walk in, you're now type 2 diabetic. And the day before she'll say you're not, based on that switch. But in reality, we know that type 2 diabetes, we're on a path years to even decades before the doctor diagnoses it. Mm-hmm. And what I come to realize is that for most of these other chronic diseases, we're also on that path. For Alzheimer's disease, before I get to the point where I can't recognize my kids anymore, or even before I forget my keys, I'm probably on that path for years to decades before. And there are things you can do with PET scan, glucose PET scans, or with MRs of the hippocampus. There are markers that you can see that show that you're on that path. But it's the same thing with cardiovascular disease. It doesn't happen the day you get a heart attack, although for half of people, that's the first symptom is sudden death, which is not a good way to diagnose it. But the point is that we're really on the path for all these diseases. And in other words, if you want to live a long lifespan, you need to pay attention to your health span. And that means looking at these diseases as, if you want to call it prevention, that's or just preparing for them and lowering your risk of them. Cancer, the same way, mental health issues, hypertension, obesity. Obesity obviously is something we can measure with a scale. So, we can track it, but it doesn't occur overnight. It's a graded thing. And, when do you call a person fat? When do you call them overweight? Obese versus overweight. Well, there's certain criteria. But the point is, let's not wait until we go into the doctor's office and he or she tells us we have the disease, because by then we're all at a disadvantage. It's not too late, but it's late, So do it while it's early.
With respect to metabolic health and longevity, isn't the simplest way to think about this just not to overeat, just to not eat too many calories? Should people be focused on the total number of calories they eat, or do you think about it in a different way?
Yeah. Well, first of all, metabolic health is at the root cause, in my opinion, of not only all those chronic diseases, but our longevity also, to the point that there are certain drugs that turn positive metabolic switches that actually dramatically increase the lifespan of model organisms like mice, and humans are taking these off-label for the same idea. So metabolism is a super powerful switch. But yeah, our diet is the number one switch we get to control our metabolism. And even if you don't want to change what you eat, there's something we can all do, and that's, like you say, is change when you eat. Just stop eating all the time. There's a metabolic advantage of not eating. My mom told me to, eat 3 meals a day with snacks in between, and then, a couple snacks at night, to, many small meals throughout the day. That was the teaching at one point. Now, I eat 1 meal a day and I've never felt better. Mm-hmm.
What do you eat? Dinner?
Yeah, when my kids come home from the school, then we all eat.
Why do you eat just one a day?
First of all, everybody's different. Everybody looks in. I've never felt better. I know by eating 1 meal a day, I'm going to be in ketosis for most of the day, just by the fact that my glucose stores get consumed after about 12 hours, the glycogen and everything. So then I switch to ketosis. Then if I add sort of a more of a metabolically healthy, which is more towards a ketogenic diet, then I'll be in ketosis even longer. And I believe that's healthy. So, but if you don't want to do that, just eat fewer times a day. Just cut snacks after dinner. What I did, my hack was as soon as I finished dinner, I brushed my teeth right away. Because again, I'm basically lazy. I knew that if I ate again, I'd have to brush my teeth again. So it kept me from eating. And then I, cut out between meal snacks, and that helped too. And there's one other trick you can do, in addition to stopping snacking between meals or fewer meals, and that is food order. And that is, if you remember the 3 macronutrients, right? Our foods are, combinations of those 3 things. And potentially the harmful one, as far as insulin resistance and inflammation, is glucose and carbohydrates. So we want to protect our body from those. And what we can do to protect them and slow the absorption of those things is, never eat carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates, sugar, starches. Never eat that as the first food of a meal. Mm-hmm. But if you can, preload yourself with cheese or with fats or oils.
Is that because it will spike your blood glucose and insulin less if it comes after those things?
Yeah, because you've already got stuff in your stomach. And if you don't believe me, there's a diabetes drug called acarbose. I don't know if you've talked about it with your audience, but it's a fascinating drug. It's there's sort of the ultimate longevity study is one founded by our federal government that they use mice for. Mice are great because they only live 3 years. It's called the Interventions Testing Program, and they just take mice and they divide them into 2 groups. They give half the mice a drug, and then the other half, they just let them live their normal lives. And then at the end of their lives, they see if there's any difference in lifespan. And it's a very simple way to track if drugs can improve lifespan. And because it's run by the federal government, it's open to all of us. So we can all write in suggestions. And so in the 20 years that it's been running, they've tested green tea green tea essence. They've done nicotinamide NAD supplements. They've done statins. They've done CoQ10. They've done curcumin. Anything you can think of, they've tested. But most of them didn't work and didn't have any effect at all. Which means if they fail the ITP, it doesn't mean they don't work at all, because metformin had no effect. But there's strong evidence that metformin is a longevity drug. But if they fail the ITP, it just means they failed at that particular dose. But there are a couple drugs that have a dramatic one. Of course, the biggest one is rapamycin, and it knocks it out of the park more than any other drug on longevity. And rapamycin specifically turns a biological switch called mTOR into a favorable metabolic state, mimicking fasting and as if your insulin was really low and turning down inflammation. But when they combined rapamycin, which they know works, with another drug, a diabetic drug called acarbose. Acarbose diabetics take, and you take it with a meal, and it blocks the absorption of glucose into your body. And when you take acarbose, it lowers your glucose spikes. But anyway, when you combine acarbose with rapamycin, you get a much more dramatic lifespan, longevity enhancement in this particular animal model. So now humans are taking acarbose off label with rapamycin for its longevity effects.
How long have you been on the dietary pattern you're on today? And can you say a little bit more about your evolution there? You mentioned previously that you've tried vegan, you've tried carnivore. What was that whole journey like for you, and how did you really narrow in on where you're at today?
Well, I narrowed in on where I was at today because, and I talk about this in the book, I had sort of an awakening. It was forced on me. Everything was going fine, everything was great, but like many people in this space, I came down with 4 chronic diseases that were unexpected, and I went to my doctors, and they said basically they're unrelated, but here's a pill for each one of them. And, you can try lifestyle, but, deal with it. You're going to have to take this pill for the rest of your life. And I knew enough about medicine that this wasn't going to end well. My kids were still in elementary school, and, I didn't want to be that guy. So I began researching it and everything. And one of the things I began understanding was there's all this research that's been done that's very compelling, controlled research about effects on metabolism, and how these 4 diseases I had and many other chronic diseases, the drugs controlled the symptoms, but they didn't really address the underlying cause. And the underlying cause is really best addressed with lifestyle. And so I dramatically changed my lifestyle, and my diet was one of the things I did at that point. And I made those changes in snacking and food order and everything to do that.
What was the composition of your diet like before you made that switch?
Before that, I was kind of like everybody else. I was sort of low fat, healthy food. For me, I was eating grains, which I don't eat anymore. I was eating a lot of seed oils, which I don't eat anymore. And I was eating, a fair amount of carbs because I was avoiding the fats. In a low-fat diet, most of the diets, if you think about the 3 macronutrients, proteins is pretty much fixed. So it's a zero-sum game. You either, not that all calories are equal, I'm not claiming that, but zero-sum in the same that you want to consume a certain number of calories. So if you increase the fat, you lower the carbs. You lower the fat, you increase the carbs. So a high-fat diet is a low-carb diet, and vice versa.
Do you think grains should be minimized or avoided by most people, or can some people do very well on them? I guess a related question to that would be like, why are you specifically avoiding grains? What is it about grains?
Yeah, great question. Grains have a couple problems with them. One, they have a protein called gluten in them that some people have issues with. It's called celiac disease, and it can make them very sick, very, very sick. And so they avoid that, and they avoid gluten altogether. There's growing evidence among experts that gluten, as well as other proteins in these grains, can have a low-grade inflammatory effect with other people who maybe they don't have celiac disease, but they have low-grade inflammation related to the grains, and they may not be aware of it. Why not? Well, low-grade inflammation can manifest as migraine headaches or irritable bowel disease or joint pain or almost any of the chronic diseases we mentioned. So driving this inflammation, and inflammation like HA1C is one of the things that increases with age. So the older you get, the more the inflammation, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact these proteins are there and they have the potential to drive inflammation, and I think they do. I avoid grains, including whole grains, for that. But it's not only the proteins. In the U.S., at least, many, if not most, grains are bathed in glyphosate, which is a weed killer that's outlawed in 30 countries around the world for health reasons, but not here. And then finally, grains typically they have a lot of carbohydrates and starches just by their nature. So I kind of exclude them for that way, but I avoid them for that reason. It's interesting though with grains because a lot of people, wisely so, will say, okay, I'm going to try this diet and I'm going to see how I feel, right? So of the three dietary choices that I make, they have a very different time scale. So in other words, if I cut out sugar and carbs, I'll feel the effect in a couple of days. So
Yeah.
is it, ask me, is it working? Yeah, I feel better, no brain fog, da, 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 da. For grains, on the other hand, because it's related to the immune system and possible, inflammation of proteins, experts are saying you should wait almost 90 days, so 3 months.
Is that just because the
Yeah.
inflammation and the activity of your immune system that's driving that and getting rid of it eventually, it just takes days or weeks for that to ramp up and ramp down?
Yeah, presumably. Yeah, it's just a much brighter window. And then the worst one, of course, is seed oils, which are stored in your body fat. So that can be a year or more, much longer time frame. So the point is you may not see immediate subjective results with giving up grains or giving up of seed oils. But if you're having diseases or conditions that you don't know what else it is, it's one thing you can do. You can give up dairy, give up seed oils, grains, etc.
Okay, so it sounds like you restrict you have a certain pattern of eating. You eat one big meal a day. So you're doing some form of time restricted feeding. You're also eating a relatively high fat, low carb diet, if I'm hearing you right. On the fat side, what types of fats are you seeking out and what types of fats are you avoiding? I know that you've already mentioned some of this, but I think it's worth reiterating.
Yeah, is fats. The whole idea of what to consume with fats is really confusing. For the fats I avoid are the high omega-6 seed oils that I mentioned, canola oil, vegetable oil, and there's a list of 8 I think that are the ones particularly avoided. And then, well, what do you substitute that with? I mean, some things you need to cook, you need a higher temperature. So the good oils that I would substitute would be olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil, those kinds of things in there. And then also fat in meat. If you eat meat, fatty meat is okay. And I get saturated fat from those as well.
Is there a difference? So on the subject of fatty meat, what kind of meat are you eating? Is there any type of meat you're avoiding? So for example, if you're eating red meat, are you paying attention to if it's grass-fed versus corn-fed or grain-fed, things like that?
Yeah, it just you go down and down in the rabbit hole. But it's important, to follow these things because I mean, well, first of all, am I eating red meat? I mean, everybody knows red meat is associated with cancer. People who eat red meat have more cancer, right? So why would I eat red meat? Well, it's because people who had red meat are more likely to have cancer. It doesn't mean that the red meat causes them to have cancer. It's causality versus correlation. So it's just like people who drive pickup trucks are more likely to have cancer than people who drive Priuses. And it's not from the automobile that they drive, it's that other factors in their lifestyle. People who drive Priuses are more or less likely to smoke cigarettes and, do other things that, or be obese even maybe perhaps. So we have to be very careful about linking causality to correlation. And the challenge, of course, with diets, there are very few good human causal studies with diets because they're just, you can't, it's almost impossible logistically to run them. So most diet information that humans have to base their knowledge on are epidemiological studies, which are correlations, which, are notoriously unreliable. So,
Mhm, mhm,
so do I eat red meat? Yeah, I do. I do now. Meat meat has a lot of nutrients. It's a source of many different things. When I was a vegan, I would have to pay really close attention to make sure I was getting those other ways. With meat, you can practically just eat meat. You don't need to eat anything else, and you'll be perfectly healthy. So I do eat red meat. Um, as far as the question you raise is really important. It's not just important for meat eaters, but also vegetable eaters. In other words, it's not enough just the end point, but it's how they got there. In other words, meat today is fed, they don't eat grass, they eat corn, and corn is low cost because it's subsidized. That's why high fructose corn syrup is so cheap. But they're fed corn, and corn is high in omega-6s, the same stuff that's in vegetable oil and
yep, yep.
these other things. So the quality of meat, if it's corn-fed meat, is going to be different than grass-fed meat. And so there's a whole nother level of meat. You can look for grass-fed meat versus regular meat, and I would prefer that. And then they have grass-finished, which is, they give them a little bit at the end, I think, and that's good too. So I would prefer to have grass-finished and grass-fed rather than just plain one. So I do pay attention to that.
Mhm. Um, I think you would probably agree that a very good way to keep track of your health and to keep yourself honest and to evaluate your progress if you're changing your lifestyle, changing your diet, and so forth, is to get blood work done on some kind of schedule, whether that's once a year, twice a year, several times a year. There's a lot of at-home blood tests now that people can use where you prick your finger, you send in a sample. That way you don't have to go into the doctor every time. You can do it from the convenience of your own home. You can do it on your own schedule. How do you feel about these at-home blood testing products? How well do they work? And do you have any general guidelines for people in terms of how often, and let's just assume we're talking about middle-aged people at least, how often they should be getting that blood work done? Is it once a year enough? Should they be going every 3 months? How often do you do it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's a revolution in the technology with these things. Elizabeth Holmes was just a little too soon, and now companies are doing, what she was talking about with the Theranos things, but it's become a reality. And this is going to revolutionize the way things are done. I mean, I use a company called Siphox out of Boston, Siphox, and I think it's like $300 or something, but they do 16 blood markers from a single at-home blood test. So they do, cortisol, testosterone, HA1C, fasting insulin, LDL, HDL, triglycerides. It's really a great panel. I have it on my website. I bought a couple hundred of them, so it's lower price. But check it against Siphox, see what you see. But that's one thing to do. So I think how often to do it really depends on the person. Are you curious? Are you, a biohacker mentality? First of all, if something's abnormal, then definitely you need to follow it up with your physician or, stay in the loop. If something's going south, then you need to frequently check it out. If everything's okay and you're in a good range, then you may just want to do it once a year or something. Or, I do it once a month or once every 2 months because I'm constantly doing interventions on myself. I'm doing like different supplements. I'm doing like red light therapy. I'm doing, all kinds of sauna, and trying hyperbaric oxygen. And unfortunately, I'm doing too many things at once, so it's impossible to tell if there's any effect, but I want to just make sure I'm not going off the rails too much. I'm not harming myself too much with any of
Mhm.
them. But anyway, the at-home testing, I think, is great. That's just one company I happen to know, but there are many others out there. And the companies, assuming they're from a credible lab and they're tested, I think the data is reliable. For the one I use, what I do is when I go in and get blood work drawn from a vein, I drop another vial and I run it on the at-home testing kit. So I've checked the numbers against the actual blood vial ones that done at Quest or LabCorp, and they're reproducible.
Yeah, I've actually
They're
done that
good.
too.
Oh, you've
Yeah,
done it.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. How should someone choose a physician? Because one of the things that we talked about, or that's implicit in a lot of what we're saying, is if you take the average physician out there, the average mainstream doctor who's going to be following the mainstream guidelines, the mainstream institutions, all of the stuff that can be very wrong for decades and decades at a time. How do I know if I'm an average person, if I'm average Joe? How do I know if my physician is the right physician for me? If they are just parroting what the big organizations are saying, if I should be trusting them? How do you shop for a physician?
Yeah, I think that's really important question because it's key. I mean, you can have a conversation with a physician, you can tell them, certain things that you believe and all, but it's really it's a challenge. And I think fortunately, I think we're undergoing a paradigm shift in the way we as individuals take control of our health. It used to be that, you go to the physician, they give you whatever, you do it, end of day. With lifestyle, the physician can't fix your lifestyle. The physician can't make you healthy. Physician can make you less sick. Um, and the idea that we have control of our lifestyle, that we have agency is a very powerful one. And I think that more and more people are embracing that. In other words, I went to medical school. I spent, decades studying stuff, but you know more about your own personal life experiences and the trauma you've had, the fractures, everything you've had than I know. I may know about more diseases perhaps in certain areas, but you're the CEO of your own health. I'm a consultant to you. And I think it's an exciting time because now as a patient, I now have agency. Every morning when I get up, I decide what I'm going to eat, when I'm going to eat, what my lifestyle is going to look like. And, we can do the at-home blood tests. And then the doctor has limited time. They have 7 minutes to talk to me. What are they going to do in 7 minutes? It's, I think to the, your question is a good one. And I think it's challenging. We need to find more and more people. We're setting up I'm involved with a new residency program, graduate medical education program for doctors out here in California in radiology and family medicine, psychiatry, where we're hopefully going to be training the next generation of doctors with some of these new attitudes that metabolic health does matter. It does play a foundational role in these things.
We are close to time here. Do you want to give everyone just a summary of the new book, what it's about, and when it comes
Sure.
out, and all those things?
Yeah. The new book, for lack of a better title, I called it Lies I Taught in Medical School. It's coming out on June 4th. And it's currently available for pre-order on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, your local library. If you'd like a free sample, free chapter, you can go to my website and get it. So far we got great response to it. It's been 16 weeks as the #1 bestseller on Amazon. It's a #2 longevity book. So it's gotten good. At least people seem to be interested about it.
Yeah, I mean, I read the first chapter, and I think it seems like a great book. I like the way that you have it laid out, as far as I can tell, and yeah, I mean, you're touching on a lot of important stuff, some of which we talked about today, but some of it we didn't get to. I will drop that link in the episode description for everyone. So if they want to pre-order that or read the first chapter, I recommend that. Dr. Lufkin, anything that you want to reiterate from our conversation that you think maybe was unclear, or any final thoughts you want to leave people with?
Thanks, Nick. I think, well, just to reiterate what we just talked about, that I'm so excited that I believe we're entering a new era in medicine. There's so much information that's available to all of us, and that we now get to take control of our own healthcare, and with our healthcare professionals who support us, but we have agency, we can drive things, we get to choose the lifestyle we do every day. And when I wake up, I find that thought just very empowering.
All right, Dr. Rob Lufkin, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Nick. I appreciate you having me on the program, and thanks for the work you're doing.